The boy hands the rider a sealed package. The rider doesn't look at the seal. He doesn't check the twine. He tucks it into his coat and spurs the horse on. And right then, the man by the window smiles for the first time all morning. Because he's figured out how he's going to take this city. And the morning had started with a chill from within, as if someone had turned off the heat right inside his bones. Daniel opens his eyes and doesn't recognize the ceiling. Low, dark, beams stained with dampness. He inhales and starts coughing. The air smells of straw and sourness. He raises his hand and sees someone else's fingers. Slender, young, stained with ink. These aren't his hands. He sits up with a jolt and nearly faints. His head explodes with pain. A table, a pewter mug, a goose quill in an inkwell. Beyond the fogged-up window, gray light and a heavy bell tolling somewhere very close by. He presses someone else's palms against someone else's face. The cheekbones are sharper. The chin is narrower. He is 34. This body is 25. There is a letter on the table. Old English, with long S letters that look like F. The letter is addressed to Daniel Ashcroft, a clerk who has arrived in Antwerp to seek a position at a trading house. He reads the name 3 times. That's his name too. The coincidence is absurdly ridiculous, and he decides not to waste any time on it. If this is a dream, he'll wake up. If not, then the name is his only gift, and he'll take it. Outside the window, water carriers are shouting in Dutch. The bell rings again. He walks over to the window and sees Antwerp. Gray roof tiles stretch toward the horizon. The cathedral's spire pierces the sky. And below, a young boy hands a package to a horseman. But the horseman doesn't check anything. Anyone could approach this boy and claim to be that very horseman. Anyone could open the package along the way and reseal it. And no one would ever know. Because there's no way to find out here. Daniel exhales slowly. For 10 years, he'd designed secure communication systems. He'd built protocols for banks handling billions. He knew by heart every way to intercept a message, to forge it, delay it, or spoof the sender. But here, there's no two-factor authentication. There's no authentication at all. Here, the king sends an order to the army, and any skilled thief with a piece of wax can swap that order for another. He stands by the window in a stranger's body in a strange city in the year 1587. And he smiles. Not out of joy, out of understanding. A quill, ink, paper. Nothing else is needed for now. For the first 3 days, he doesn't leave the room. He writes. Not letters. He pours everything he remembers onto paper. Symmetric ciphers, disposable notebooks, division of secrets, checksums, trust hierarchies. 16 hours a day, he gnaws on stale bread and writes. His memory works like a machine. Formulas, diagrams, specific hacks from reports. The entire history of cryptography, from Caesar to quantum machines, lies in his head. And it's all useless. For now. Because knowledge without people is just ink on paper. On the 4th day, he steps out onto the street, and Antwerp hits all his senses at once. Manure, fish, smoke. The sweat of thousands of people living too close together. He bends over, straightens up, walks on. He needs to understand this world from the inside, not from books. He watches all day long. A merchant dictates a letter to a scribe right in the square. out loud, in front of 20 witnesses. A courier with an embossed bag tosses it onto a bench in a tavern and goes to drink beer. Two merchants shout out pepper prices for the whole street to hear. This is a world with no concept of the secrecy of correspondence. They aren't stupid. They're cunning and ruthlessly practical. But they don't know what he knows. That information is a weapon. That the method of transmission is more important than the letter itself. That the person who controls the communication channel controls both parties to the conversation. On the fifth day, he finds an office on Hoogstraat. The owner, Hendrik Spielman, deals in cloth and leather and is looking for a clerk who knows English. Daniel arrives wearing only a doublet and places a letter bearing his name on the table. Spielman asks if he knows how to count. Daniel mentally calculates a shipment of 30 bales at 4 guilders each, minus a 12% port duty, and gives the total in 3 seconds. Spielman blinks and hires him on the spot. For 4 weeks, Daniel works as the perfect clerk. He arrives before everyone else. He leaves after everyone else. But most importantly, he watches. How they fold a letter, what they use to seal it, what kind of wax, where they place the seal, who they hand it over to for delivery. He memorizes everything. He learns that there are 3 types of couriers in the city: city messengers, merchant couriers, and trusted couriers for noble households and bankers. The latter cost 10 times as much and are just as unreliable, because a courier's loyalty rests solely on his word of honor. There's no way to verify it. There's no way to know if he opened the package along the way. One evening, Spielman receives a letter from London and spends half an hour cursing. His partner insists that Spielman quoted a price 20% lower. Someone changed the figure, or his partner is lying, or the courier swapped out the letter. There's no way to prove it. There's no way to prove that the letter wasn't tampered with after it was sent. Daniel listens to Spielman's outburst and thinks about checksums, about a small marker that breaks whenever the text is altered. It's so simple that it's done with pen and paper. No computer, no electricity, pure arithmetic. He remains silent. It's not time yet. He doesn't need an employer. He needs a client. A man who's already been burned, who's already lost money and reputation because of an intercepted letter. And 6 weeks later, fate brings him just such a man. Willem van Horn, a pepper merchant, rich, angry, and desperate. Someone is methodically ruining him. A competitor learns of every one of his deals in advance. Every price is undercut a day early. 3 contracts in 2 months have gone to waste. Van Horn is certain there's a spy in the house, but he can't figure out who. Daniel sits in the corner, copying invoices and catching every word. Van Horn leaves. Spielman shakes his head and says the poor man will soon be ruined. Then Daniel quietly asks for permission to speak with Van Horn. Spielman looks at him as if he's crazy, but Daniel explains that he'll find the source of the leak without searching the house. Spielman shrugs and gives him an address. The next day, Daniel stands in Van Horn's office. Oak paneling, a Flemish carpet, silver candlesticks. Van Horn looks down at him, a young clerk, a nobody. Daniel doesn't waste time on pleasantries. He says he has no intention of looking for the spy. He says the spy will find him on his own. Van Horn frowns. Daniel asks for 3 evenings and the last 4 business letters. Nothing else. Van Horn wants to refuse, but he's desperate. And those who are desperate agree to strange proposals. So Daniel gets his 3 evenings. Daniel worked 3 evenings in a row. The method was ridiculously simple. He took Van Horn's 4 most recent letters to his business partners and copied each one. In each copy, he changed one key number, the price per pound of pepper. In the letter to the Amsterdam partner, he wrote 14 stevers. In the letter to the Ghent supplier, 16. In the letter to the Cologne broker, 12. In the letter to Van Horn's own brother-in-law, Frans de Graaf, 18. Each recipient saw his own price, and only Daniel knew which figure went to whom. Van Horn sealed the letters with his seal and sent them in the usual manner via his usual couriers. All that remained was to wait. 9 days. On the 10th day, Van Horn's competitor, a merchant named Hutton, made an offer for a large shipment of pepper. The price was half a gulden below 18 stevers. 18, to be exact. Daniel went to Van Horn and silently placed a slip of paper with 4 numbers in front of him. 14, 16, 12, 18. Then he circled the last one. Van Horn didn't understand right away. Then he turned pale. 18 stevers were mentioned in the letter addressed to Frans de Graaf, his brother-in-law, his sister's husband, the man with whom he had dinner every Sunday, the man to whom he had entrusted his business secrets for 12 years. Van Horn sat in silence for a minute, then 2. In the 3rd minute, he looked up at Daniel, and his gaze was completely different. It was no longer the gaze of a wealthy merchant looking at a lowly clerk. It was the gaze of a man who had just witnessed a magic trick and wanted to know how it worked. Daniel explained. Not everything. He explained exactly as much as was necessary. He said this method was called the canary trap. Each suspect is fed a unique version of the secret. When the secret surfaces, its unique marker points to the source of the leak. Simple, reliable. No need for searches or interrogations. Van Horn asked what to do next. Daniel said that catching the spy was only half the job. The other half was making sure they wouldn't have to catch the next one. Because Van Horn's problem wasn't his brother-in-law. The problem was that any of his letters could be read by anyone who gained access to them, a courier, a servant, or a random thief. Van Horn's letters were written in plain text, like a postcard. Van Horn objected, saying that he encrypted some of his letters. Daniel asked to see one. Van Horn took a sheet of paper with a substitution table out of his chest. Each letter was replaced by another, A for G, B for D, and so on. 26 substitutions. Daniel looked at the table and had to summon all his self-control not to laugh. A mono-alphabetic substitution cipher. Essentially, the Caesar cipher. It can be cracked in 15 minutes by anyone who knows how to calculate letter frequencies. In Dutch, the most frequent letter is E. Find the most frequent letter in the ciphertext. That's the E. Then, following the pattern, the entire alphabet is reconstructed. Daniel didn't tell Van Horn that his cipher was child's play. Instead, he said he could offer something better. Much better. And that from that day on, no one but the addressee would be able to read any of Van Horn's letters. Van Horn asked how much it would cost. Daniel named his price, 20 guilders a month. To Van Horn, that was a pittance. Van Horn agreed that very evening. A 1-year contract, 240 guilders, his first pay. Daniel returned to his room above the shop and sat down at his desk. Blank sheets of paper lay before him. It was time to get to work. He started small. For Van Horn, he created a 2-part system. Part 1, the code book. Not a simple letter-for-letter substitution. A full-fledged glossary with 300 code words for the most common trade terms. Pepper was 347. Price was 512. Amsterdam was 089. But unlike any glossary used in that era, Van Horn's book had a unique feature. The code numbers changed every month. What meant pepper today would mean silk 30 days later. Even if someone stole the book, it would only work until the end of the month. Part 2. Control Marker. Daniel devised a simple arithmetic procedure for Van Horn. The sender takes the numerical values of the first 5 code words in the letter. They add them together. They divide the sum by a secret number known only to the sender and the recipient. The remainder of the division is written at the end of the letter as the batch number. If anyone changes even a single word in the letter, the verification marker will not match. The recipient would see this instantly. For the first time in his life, Van Horn could be certain that the letter he received was not forged. Daniel spent 2 weeks creating this system. Then he spent another week explaining it to Van Horn. That was harder than creating it. Van Horn was a smart man, but the concept of changing keys was beyond anything he knew about the world. He was used to locks. A lock is either locked or unlocked. A key either fits or it doesn't. The idea of throwing away a key and making a new one every month seemed like madness to him. Why change the lock if it's strong? Daniel explained patiently, over and over again. He said that a strong lock on a door is useless if a thief can make a duplicate key while the owner is asleep. The only way to protect yourself is to change the lock faster than the thief can make duplicates. Van Horn finally understood, or pretended to understand. In any case, the system worked. The first month passed without incident. The second, too. In the third month, Hut, Van Horn's rival, tried to intercept another letter. The courier had been bribed. The letter was opened, but inside were only numbers, meaningless columns of numbers. Without the codebook, which changed every month and which Van Horn kept in a safe with 3 locks, it was impossible to decipher them. Hutton received a piece of paper full of gibberish, and Van Horn received proof that the system worked. He told his 3 closest business partners about it. Word got around. Daniel had been waiting for this. He rented 2 rooms above a bookbinder's shop on Kammerstraat. He hung up a modest sign, House of Trusted Letters, an office dedicated to ensuring the security of business correspondence, encryption and correspondence protection services. No one came to see him the first week, nor in the second. In the third week, a jeweler named Adrian Bakker came by. His partner in Bruges claimed he had never received a letter confirming the order for 200 gold rings. Bakker insisted he had sent it. It was impossible to determine the truth. Someone was lying. Or the letter had been stolen. Or the courier had lost it and was afraid to admit it. Daniel proposed a system with delivery confirmation to Bakker. Each letter contained a unique number. Upon receipt, the recipient would send back a short note with that number, encrypted with a separate key. If the note did not arrive within the agreed-upon time, the sender would know that the letter had not been delivered. Bakker signed the contract, 15 guilders a month. A week after Bakker, a second jeweler came. Then a third, the trade dealer in silk, a money changer from a pawn shop. Van Horn brought his partner. By the end of the 4th month, Daniel had 7 clients, 55 guilders in monthly income, enough to eat and pay for a room. Not enough to get ahead, and catastrophically little for what he was actually planning, because Daniel had no intention of remaining a cipherer for Antwerp pepper merchants. It was a stepping stone, the first of many. But for the next step, he needed people, not clients, employees. People he could trust with part of the system, people who could run things when he wasn't in the office, people who could travel with letters. People who could keep quiet.
And that was the hardest task of all.
Because cryptography is math, and math can be verified. People can't be verified. Not completely. Never. He thought about this every night as he fell asleep on his straw mattress. He knows the formulas. He'll build the protocols. But one corrupt employee and everything comes crashing down. One mistake by one person and the trust he spent months building will burn to the ground in an hour. He needs people, the right people, and he has no idea where to find them. Annika DeVos came to the office in her 6th month, not as a client, as a supplicant. She stood in the doorway, thin, pale, her hands reddened from cold water. A widow, 27 years old. Her husband had been a bookbinder. He'd died of a fever 8 months ago. He'd left her a shop and a 7-year-old daughter named Lisbeth. The Bookbinders Guild had denied the widow the right to continue her husband's business. The building belonged to the guild. The widow and her child were required to vacate the premises by the end of the month. Annika had come to Daniel not because she knew who he was. She came because he was renting rooms above her late husband's shop. She asked if he needed help with paperwork. She knew how to write, count, and keep accounts. Her husband had taught her. Daniel looked at her, then at her hands, then at her again. He said he needed help with the paperwork and offered her 5 guilders a month. Annika accepted without haggling. It wasn't much, but it was 5 guilders more than nothing. The first week, she kept the accounts. Income, expenses, payments for ink and paper, the cost of sealing wax and sand for drying, and rent. She was as precise as clockwork. Not a single mistake, not a single smudge. Daniel watched. The second week, he had her copy a code book for one of the clients. 300 words, 300 numerical correspondences. Annika copied them in 4 hours without a single mistake. He checked it twice. Not a single incorrect number. In the third week, he asked her a question. He showed her 2 letters. One was genuine. One had an altered digit. The check digit in the forged letter didn't match. He asked if she could tell which of the 2 letters was genuine. Annika looked at both, then at him, then back at the letters. She didn't know what a check digit was. She didn't know why the numbers at the end were necessary. But she noticed that in one letter, the last number was different from what it should be if you added up the previous ones. She didn't know the formula. She saw the pattern, intuitively, in 3 minutes. At that moment, Daniel realized 2 things. First, Annika DeVos wasn't just a literate woman with good handwriting. She had a mathematical mind, sharp and quick, suppressed by circumstances, but still alive. Second, he had found his first real employee. He began to teach her, slowly, carefully, one element of the system at a time. First, the substitution principle, then the principle of interchangeable keys, then the control markers, then the rules for destroying drafts. Annika absorbed it all. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't ask for explanations. She understood why. She was a widow in a world where a widow without money or a guild was a nobody. Daniel wasn't giving her a job. He was giving her power, knowledge that no other man in Antwerp possessed except him. By the end of her 2nd month on the job, Annika was handling the encryption for 3 clients on her own. Daniel checked every letter. There were no mistakes. In the 3rd month, something happened that changed their relationship forever. The city magistrate sent Annika a notice. Her late husband's house was being transferred to the guild. She was given 2 weeks to vacate the premises. Annika came to the office with this notice and red eyes. She didn't cry in front of him. She placed the paper on the table and said that if he knew a lawyer, she would be grateful. Daniel read the notice. Then he sat down and thought for 10 minutes. Then he wrote a letter. Not to a lawyer. He wrote a letter to the mayor of Antwerp. On paper bearing the seal of the House of Faithful Letters. The letter contained no threats. There were no requests. It contained a single sentence. Daniel wrote that Mrs. de Vos was a trusted representative of the firm handling correspondence for the Van Horn Trading House and the Fugger banking branch, and that any difficulties in her personal affairs would inevitably lead to difficulties in her employer's business. It was a lie. The Fuggers were not yet Daniel's clients. But the mayor didn't know that, and the Fuggers' name carried more weight in Antwerp than the opinion of any guild. 4 days later, Annika received a new notice. The house remained hers. The guild had backed down. Annika read the document. Then she looked at Daniel. She didn't thank him. She said just one sentence. She said that from that day on, he could trust her with everything. Daniel nodded. He understood what she meant. Not gratitude. A vow. From that day on, Annika became a top-tier cryptographer. The only person besides Daniel who knew the system's full structure. Not all the keys, but the architecture. How the access levels were organized. How the division of secrets among clients worked. How the rotating keys were generated. If Daniel were to die tomorrow, Annika could keep the agency running. Not at full capacity, but enough so that the clients wouldn't lose contact. That was more important than any contract. Because an agency without a successor is vulnerable. And vulnerability in the world of spies and intercepted letters means death. A month later, Daniel received a letter. A real letter. Not from a client. From a man who introduced himself as an agent of the Fugger Trading House, the Antwerp branch of Europe's largest banking house, the Fuggers of Augsburg. They lent money to the Habsburgs. They financed wars. They traded in silver from the New World and copper from Tyrol. Their couriers carried letters that were 100 or more valuable than the gold they were transporting. An agent named Christoph Lindner came to the office on Kammerstrasse. He was as thin as a rake. His face was impassive. His eyes were calculating. He didn't smile. Lindner said that the Fugger Trading House had lost 3 confidential letters over the past 6 months. 1 between Antwerp and Augsburg. 2 between Antwerp and Lisbon. Intercepted. The contents had become known to competitors. The losses amounted to a sum that Lindner whispered. 8,000 guilders. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't let it show. 8,000 guilders. With that money, one could buy 3 houses in the center of Antwerp. Lindner asked if the House of Secure Letters could ensure the protection of correspondence between the Antwerp and Augsburg branches. Daniel said it could. Lindner asked what guarantees there were. Daniel said there was only one guarantee. If even a single letter protected by his system were read by an outsider, he would refund the entire contract amount. The whole amount. Down to the last staver. For the first time during the entire conversation, Lindner blinked. No one in Europe had ever offered such guarantees. Because no one in Europe could offer them. Daniel could. Because he knew something no one else knew. He knew that his system couldn't be broken. Not mathematically. It could only be broken by people. And he controlled the people. For now. Lindner left and returned a week later with the contract. 120 guilders a month. 1,500 a year. More than all of Daniel's other clients combined. Daniel signed it. Annika stood beside him. When Lindner left, She looked at the contract amount and her hands trembled. 120 guilders a month. Her late husband had earned 20. Daniel looked up at her and said that starting that day, she would need an assistant, because the workload would double. And a single-digit error in a single letter would ruin everything. Annika nodded. She already knew who she would look for. The firm was growing. But along with the money and reputation, something else was growing as well. Attention. Daniel could feel it like a draft. Still faint for now, still imperceptible to the untrained eye, but he saw it. The man in the gray raincoat who had walked past the office twice that week, moving far too slowly. The question posed to Spielman by one of the port officials. Curiosity. Someone was starting to take an interest in the small office on Kammerstraat, whose clients had suddenly stopped losing their letters. Daniel didn't yet know exactly who was interested, but he knew it was inevitable. In a world where everyone reads other people's letters, a man whose letters cannot be read will sooner or later attract the attention of those who are used to reading everything. The first test of his resolve came in the 7th month. A courier named Peter, whom Daniel had hired to deliver the Fugger letters between Antwerp and Brussels, did not return on time. He was supposed to be back by noon on Wednesday. Wednesday passed. Thursday passed. On Friday morning, Peter showed up at the office with a split lip and no bag. He explained that he'd been stopped on the road outside Mechelen by 2 men. Not robbers. They hadn't touched his wallet. They'd taken only the bag with the letters. Daniel listened. Then he asked one question. He asked if the attackers knew exactly what was in the bag. Peter said they did. They told him outright. They named the recipient. So this wasn't a random robbery. It was a targeted ambush. Someone knew that Peter was carrying the Fugger letters. Someone knew the route. Someone knew the departure time. Daniel let Peter go and closed the door behind him. Then he sat down at the table. Then he smiled, because this was exactly the scenario he had been counting on. The letters in Peter's bag were a trap, not the Fuggers' real correspondence, but forged letters that Daniel had composed specifically for this purpose. He'd begun to suspect a leak 3 weeks ago, when he noticed someone asking at the Harbor Tavern about the schedule of the House of Faithful Letters couriers. He didn't try to track down the leak directly. He used the same method he'd used with Van Horn, only on a larger scale. He created 4 versions of the route schedule. He showed each one to a different person. Peter received the version with the route through Mechelen on Wednesday. The interception took place in Mechelen on Wednesday. So the leak was coming through Peter, not necessarily of his own volition. Maybe Peter let it slip at the tavern. Maybe someone had been following him from the office itself. But the source had been identified. Daniel fired Peter that very same day, without explanation, without accusations. He simply said that his services were no longer needed. Peter left, feeling hurt and confused. But the real blow wasn't intended for Peter. The real blow lay in the content of the intercepted letters. The forged Fugger letters contained false information about a major copper purchase in Tyrol. The figures were convincing. The details were precise. Anyone reading these letters would believe that the Fuggers were planning to buy up the entire Tyrolean copper supply at an inflated price. And whoever believed this would try to get ahead of the game. 3 weeks later, the Bonvisi banking house in Lyon signed a contract to purchase Tyrolean copper at a price 30% above market value. They planned to resell it to the Fuggers at a markup. The Fuggers did not buy. The price fell. The Bonvisis lost 4,000 guilders. Lindner arrived at the office a month after the incident. He already knew what had happened. The Fuggers' intelligence network worked slowly but surely. He knew the letters were forgeries. He knew the Bonvisis had fallen into a trap. He knew that Daniel had set up his client's competitors by using the intercepted correspondence as a weapon. Lindner didn't smile, but his voice grew half a tone warmer. He said that the Augsburg office was impressed, and that there was talk of extending the contract. Daniel nodded. Inside, he was overjoyed. But his face remained calm. The contract with the Fuggers had doubled. 240 guilders a month. Now Daniel was handling not only the Antwerp to Augsburg route, but also the Antwerp to Lisbon line. Atlantic trade. Silver from the New World. Sums that made his head spin. And a responsibility that made it spin even more. He needed couriers. New ones. Reliable ones. Not like Peter. The problem was that reliability couldn't be bought. You can buy temporary loyalty. You can buy a week's worth of silence. But true reliability has to be cultivated. That was exactly when Maggie Casters came into his life. He wasn't looking for her. She found him on her own. Or, more precisely, Annika found her. A 22-year-old red-haired Scottish woman, tall, lean, with a weather-beaten face and hands accustomed to rains. She had come to Antwerp with a group of Scottish Protestant refugees after the massacre in Perth. She had no money, no connections, and didn't speak the language. She spoke English with such an accent that half the English people in Antwerp couldn't understand her. But she could ride better than any man Daniel had seen in this city. Annika met her at the market. Maggie was trying to sell the horse because she couldn't afford to feed it. Annika looked at the horse, then at Maggie. Then she came over to Daniel and said she'd found a courier. Daniel met Maggie at the tavern on Groenplatz. She sat as straight as a stick. She stared at him without blinking. She waited. He asked if she could make it to Brussels in a single day. She said she could make it to Brussels in half a day if the road wasn't muddy. He asked what she would do if they stopped her on the road and demanded she hand over the bag. She said it depended on how many of them there were. He asked what if there were 3. She said that in that case, she wouldn't stop. Daniel hired her on the spot. 8 guilders a month, plus feed for the horse. Maggie didn't haggle. But before leaving, she paused and asked one thing. She asked if he would ask for her opinion or just give orders. Daniel paused. Then he said he would ask. Maggie nodded and left. And from her very first trip, she began bringing him something more than just the letters she delivered. She brought observations. Maggie saw things that no one else saw. She noticed that a new guard post had appeared on the bridge over the Dial, manned by men wearing the colors of the Duke of Parma. She noticed that 2 taverns in Mechelen, which had previously served as staging posts for couriers, had closed. She noticed that the same horseman was riding along the road from Brussels for the 3rd time that month without stopping in a single town. Daniel began sitting down with her after every trip and asking her in detail what she had seen, who she had met, what had seemed strange. Maggie blossomed, not outwardly, but inwardly. For the first time in her life, someone was asking her not only where she'd been, but also what she thought. The team was growing. Daniel, Annika, Maggie. 3 people, a small office, but no longer just a lone clerk. By the 10th month, Daniel was serving 12 clients. The office's income was 400 guilders a month. Serious money. Enough to hire more people, to expand the office, to buy better ink and better paper, and enough to attract serious attention. It came at the end of the year, in the evening, without a knock. The office door opened and a woman walked in. She was wearing a travel coat. Her face was hidden by a veil, thin leather gloves. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to having people stand before her. She removed one glove. On her ring finger was a ring bearing a coat of arms. Daniel didn't recognize the coat of arms, but he knew English craftsmanship when he saw it. The woman said she was representing the interests of a certain individual in London, an individual who would very much like to speak with Mr. Ashcroft about his remarkable enterprise. She did not give a name. There was no need. In London, in the year 1587, there was only one person who sent women in traveling cloaks with rings bearing a coat of arms to foreign cities for secret conversations. Sir Francis Walsingham. Elizabeth's chief spy. The man who deciphered Mary Stuart's correspondence and sent her to the scaffold. The man who maintained the most powerful intelligence network in Europe. And this man wanted to speak with Daniel. Daniel stood at his desk. He looked at the woman in the veil, and he felt two emotions welling up in his chest at the same time. The first was fear, because catching Walsingham's attention meant ending up on a chessboard where the pieces never go back into the box. The second was something akin to excitement, because Walsingham was the first real player who had taken notice of him. And if Daniel wanted to become something more than just a code breaker for pepper merchants, then this conversation had to happen, sooner or later. He told the woman he'd be happy to hear her proposal. The woman smiled beneath her veil. He didn't see the smile, but he heard it in her voice. She said the proposal would arrive within a month, with details. Then she turned and left. Annika was standing in the doorway of the back room. She'd heard everything. She looked at Daniel, and he saw a question in her eyes. Not fear, a question. He shook his head. Not yet. Later. Annika nodded and went back to work. Daniel sat down at the table and stared at the candle. Walsingham. A whole new phase was beginning. Walsingham's proposal arrived not in a month, but in 6 weeks. It came in the form of an unsigned letter. The paper was of good quality, English. The handwriting was clerical. The text was written in code, a mono-alphabetic substitution cipher with a 100-word list. Daniel deciphered it in 20 minutes without consulting the codebook. He cracked the cipher using frequency analysis within the first 5 minutes. He spent the remaining 15 minutes consulting the codebook, selecting code words based on context. It was Walsingham's own cipher, the best cipher used by Europe's finest intelligence service. And it had been cracked in 20 minutes. Daniel sat poring over the decrypted letter, thinking about the fact that Walsingham was using this cipher to communicate with his agents across the continent. Dozens of people were risking their lives every day, yet their correspondence could be read by any literate mathematician with an evening to spare. The content of the letter was simple. The English Crown was interested in the services of the House of Faithful Letters. A meeting is proposed. The time and place will be specified later. If he agrees, Mr. Ashcroft is to send a reply via the messenger who delivered the previous message, who will contact him again. If he refuses, Mr. Ashcroft is advised to carefully reconsider his position. The last sentence was a threat, a gentle one, a polite one, but a threat nonetheless. Daniel mulled over his response for 3 days. He could not refuse. Refusal meant that Walsingham would view him as a potential threat, a man whose letters could not be read and who, moreover, refused to cooperate. Such a man was, by definition, dangerous. But he couldn't agree unconditionally either. Becoming Walsingham's agent meant becoming the property of the English crown, losing his neutrality, losing all the clients who were enemies of England. And in 1588, England's enemies comprised half of Europe. He needed a third option, neither yes nor no. but what he called to himself the handshake protocol. To establish contact, to exchange an initial show of trust, without giving away anything critical. He wrote a reply, not in Walsingham's cipher, in his own. Along with the letter, he enclosed a sheet with decryption instructions, simple enough for one of Walsingham's men to decipher within an hour, but elegant enough for Walsingham to see the difference between his own cipher and Daniel's. It was a calling card, a demonstration. The letter stated that the House of Faithful Letters is ready to discuss cooperation on mutually beneficial terms, that Daniel Ashcroft is not a subject of any crown and has no intention of becoming one, that he sells a service, not loyalty, and that he would be happy to demonstrate the capabilities of his system in a face-to-face meeting. A veiled woman came for a reply 2 days later. She took the sealed package and left without saying a word. The reply from London arrived 3 weeks later. A meeting. Calais. In a month. Daniel knew that Calais was English territory in name only. Formally, the city belonged to France, but there was an English presence there. Consuls, trade agents, spies. A neutral ground, more or less. While he was waiting for the meeting, something else happened. Something he hadn't expected. A man came into the office, not young, graying, in worn but clean clothes, with the face of a man who hadn't smiled in a very long time. He introduced himself as Johann Verkamen, a former monk of the Dominican order, a specialist in ancient languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Church Slavonic. He had left the order. He didn't say why, but Daniel could see it in his eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and after that, couldn't stay. Johann said he'd heard about an office that dealt with letters, and that he needed a job. Any job. He was willing to copy, translate, count, anything, as long as he didn't have to go back. He didn't specify where. Daniel looked at his hands, the hands of a scribe, a callus on the middle finger of his right hand from the quill. 20 years of uninterrupted writing had left that callus. He asked Johann one question. He asked if Johann knew how to keep secrets. Johann looked at him long and hard. Then he said that he had kept confessions secret for 20 years and had never broken a single one, even when those whose confessions he had heard used his silence to do things for which he would be answerable to God. Daniel hired him, 10 guilders a month. Johann became the 4th. His role was quickly defined. Daniel kept records. Lots of records. Not the content of clients' letters, he didn't read them, but the metadata. Who was writing to whom? How often? How much? When they stopped writing? When they resumed? The rhythm of the correspondence sometimes spoke louder than the content. If a banker suddenly started writing to a military officer 3 times a week instead of once a month, that meant something. If 2 trading houses stopped corresponding at the same time, that also meant something. Daniel collected this data, but he needed someone who could organize it, store it, index it. Someone with the patience of a monk and the memory of an archivist. Johann was the perfect fit. He began maintaining what Daniel privately referred to as a metadata database, a large, leather-bound book locked in an iron chest. It contained dates, names, frequencies, volumes, and routes. Not a single word from the letters themselves, only the structure of the information flows. Johann worked on it every evening, silently, methodically, as if he were praying. The meeting in Calais took place in February 1588. It was bitterly cold. Daniel rode on horseback with Maggie. She had insisted. He hadn't argued. 2 days on the road through Flanders. Maggie didn't ask any questions about the purpose of the trip. She could see he was tense, and that was enough. Calais. a small port town. Dirty, damp, smelling of fish and tar. The meeting was scheduled at a tavern by the harbor. Daniel went in alone. Maggie stayed outside with the horses. A man was sitting at a table in the corner. Not Walsingham, a trusted associate. He introduced himself as Thomas Philippes. Daniel recognized the name. He knew it from a past life, from the history of cryptography he'd studied in college. Thomas Philippes, Walsingham's chief codebreaker, the man who had broken Mary Stuart's cipher and secured her death sentence. One of the finest cryptanalysts of the 16th century, and he was sitting across from Daniel. Short, freckled, with a yellowish beard and piercing eyes. Philippes wasted no time on pleasantries. He placed 3 sheets of paper on the table, 3 intercepted letters, encrypted using Daniel's system. Letters from clients of the House of Faithful Letters, intercepted by Walsingham's agents over the past 2 months. Philippes said he hadn't been able to read them. His voice was even, but Daniel heard something in it. Not anger, not resentment. Hunger. Professional hunger. Philippes wanted to understand. He said he'd tried everything. Frequency analysis, going through the nomenclature, comparisons with known plaintext. Nothing. The letters didn't form a language. The numbers showed no pattern. He'd spent 3 full days on each letter and hadn't made a single bit of progress. Daniel listened, and for the first time in a year in this world, he felt genuine respect for the person he was talking to. Philippes was a genius. Without a computer, without probability theory, without statistical tools. He cracked codes using only his mind and intuition. And the fact that he couldn't crack Daniel's system was not a weakness on Philippes' part, but a testament to the power of 21st century cryptography. Daniel told Philippes that these letters couldn't be read, not because the cipher was too complex, but because each letter is encrypted with a unique key that is used only once and then destroyed. Even if Philippes somehow managed to figure out the key to one letter, it wouldn't help with the rest. Philippes was silent for a full minute. Then he said one word. He said, "It was beautiful." Daniel nodded. Then the real conversation began. Philippes relayed Walsingham's terms. The English Crown wanted Daniel to encrypt the correspondence between London and English agents on the continent. In return, Daniel would receive protection, patronage, and a great deal of money. Daniel replied that he was willing to encrypt the English Crown's correspondence, but on his own terms. First, he would encrypt the correspondence. He would not decrypt anyone else's. He would not break the codes of England's enemies for Walsingham. Philippes had his own code breakers. Let them do their job. Second, the House of Trusted Letters retains its independence. Daniel does not become an agent of the English Crown. He is a contractor, a service provider, not a possession. Third, no single English agent will have access to the entire system. Each agent will have their own individual key. The loss of one agent will not compromise the others. Philippes listened. He wasn't surprised. He had expected some bargaining. He said he would relay the terms to London. But he added a personal remark. He said that if Daniel thought he could sit on the fence forever, he was mistaken. Sooner or later, he would have to choose a side. Daniel looked him in the eye and replied that his side was the letters. Philippes smirked. They parted ways, if not as friends, then as professionals who recognized each other's caliber. A week later, a reply arrived from London. Walsingham accepted the terms, with one condition. If Daniel were to work for England's enemies, and Walsingham found out, the consequences would be irreversible. Daniel read this condition and thought that Walsingham would, of course, find out. because Daniel would, of course, be working for England's enemies. The question isn't whether he would or not. The question is whether Walsingham would be able to prove it. And he wouldn't be able to prove it, because the system is set up so that no client knows of the existence of other clients. The English wouldn't know that their letters are being encrypted by the same person who encrypts the Spaniards' letters. The Spaniards won't know that their letters are being encrypted by the same person who encrypts the English letters. And each side will be convinced that Daniel works only for them. It was beautiful. And it was dangerous. Deadly dangerous. One slip-up, and both sides would kill him at the same time. But Daniel smiled to himself, because that was exactly what his plan was. Not to serve a single master. To become a bridge between everyone. A bridge that couldn't be burned, because without it, everyone would be left in the dark. He returned to Antwerp. Annika was waiting for him at the office. She looked at him and understood everything from the expression on his face. He said they had a new client, a big one. She asked how big. He said so big that they'd need 2 more people, at least. Annika nodded. The wheel began to turn faster. The spring of 1588 brought the smell of gunpowder to Antwerp. Not literally, but Daniel could sense it in the letters. The volume of correspondence between Madrid and Brussels had tripled in 2 months. The Fuggers were receiving 3 couriers a week instead of 1. The Venetian consul in Antwerp sent more letters in March than in the entire previous year. Johann sat at his metadata book every evening until midnight, indexing the data streams. He didn't know what these spikes meant. Daniel knew. The Spanish Armada. Philip II was assembling a fleet to invade England. 130 ships, 30,000 soldiers. The largest military operation of the century. And all of Europe was writing to one another about it, on paper that could be intercepted, stolen, forged, or delayed. Daniel stood by the window and looked out at the Antwerp harbor, where far to the south, in Lisbon and Cadiz, ships were being loaded with cannons and soldiers. And here, in his small office on Kammerstraat, the threads that connected all the participants in this drama converged. The English used his system to write to their agents in the Netherlands. The Fuggers used his system to write to their partners in Augsburg about marine cargo insurance. And 3 weeks after signing the contract with Walsingham, a new client came to the office. A Spaniard. Not in person, of course, an intermediary. A Flemish merchant named Jacob Hasselt, who did business with the Spanish crown and needed a secure line of communication between Antwerp and the Escorial. Daniel looked at Hasselt and thought. Hasselt was not a spy. He was a businessman. But his correspondence went to the Escorial, and at the Escorial sat Philip II and his secretaries. The information that a Spanish agent in Antwerp was using the services of the House of Faithful Letters would reach Spanish intelligence, sooner or later. And then the Spaniards would come for him, just as the English had. Daniel signed a contract with Hasselt, 60 guilders a month, a separate codebook, a separate set of keys, a separate courier route. Not a single point of intersection with the English system. 2 worlds in one office, separated by a wall of numbers. Annika knew about both contracts. She was the only one besides Daniel. She didn't ask a single question. But one evening, when they were alone, she said that if the English found out, they'd hang him. Daniel replied that they wouldn't find out. Annika looked at him and said she hoped so. Her voice didn't waver, but she was standing a little closer than usual, as if she wanted to shield him from something with her own body. Daniel noticed this and looked away. He needed people, More people. The contract with the British required couriers on the routes through Calais and Dover. The contract with Hasselt required couriers on the southern routes. Maggie couldn't handle it alone. And then Annika said she knew someone, a woman, a French woman. Isabelle de Croix showed up at the office in early May. She walked in the way people do who are used to doors being open for them. Her back was straight. Her chin was slightly raised. Her eyes were gray and calm. 31 years old. Her face was beautiful, but not soft. The face of someone who had seen enough to no longer be surprised. Annika knew her through the Widows' Circle, a group of women left without husbands and without status, who met on Thursdays at St. James's Church. And Zabel was not a widow. She was a runaway. The illegitimate daughter of a minor French aristocrat. She grew up at the court of Catherine de' Medici as part relative, part servant. A lady-in-waiting, a messenger, a beautiful doll sent on errands. She saw the inner workings of high politics. She saw how smiles hid daggers. She saw how a single word spoken at dinner could decide the fate of a province. Then they tried to use her in one of the palace intrigues, one too sordid even for her. She didn't reveal the details. She fled to Antwerp with a single trunk and not a single letter of recommendation. Daniel spoke with her for an hour. He didn't ask about her past. He asked 3 things. Did she know the protocol of the French court? Could she determine a person's background and intentions based on their gestures and manners? Did she understand the difference between what people say and what they mean? Isabel answered all 3 questions with a single sentence. She said she had grown up in a place where a misread gesture meant death. Daniel hired her. Isabel's role was clear from the start. She didn't decode messages. She didn't deliver letters. She read people. When a new client came into the office, Isabel would sit in the next room behind a slightly ajar door. Then she would tell Daniel what she had observed. This one's nervous. That one's left eye twitches when he talks about his partner. This one is lying about the reason for his visit. This one can be trusted. For Daniel, it was like having a biometric authentication system in a world where even passports didn't exist. He knew codes. She knew people. Together, they covered both sides of security. The summer of 1588. The Armada set sail from Lisbon. All of Europe held its breath. Letters flew like arrows. The English demanded daily reports from their agents along the coast. The Fuggers demanded confirmation that their cargo was safe. Spanish merchants, via Hasselt, wanted to know everything about the movements of English ships. Daniel worked 20 hours a day. Annika slept on a bench in the office. Maggie made 2 trips a week instead of 1, driving the horses until they were hoarse. Johann never left the archive room. His metadata book had doubled in size in a month. And Daniel saw a pattern that no one else saw. He didn't read the letters, but he saw the rhythm. He saw that English correspondence with the Netherlands had increased sharply a week before the Armada passed La. He saw that the Fuggers had begun insuring ships at triple rates 10 days before the first battle. He saw that Spanish correspondents from Brussels had suddenly fallen silent for 3 days before the Battle of Gravelines. Silence. It was more terrifying than any letter. When the Escorial falls silent, it means a decision has been made and words are no longer needed. Daniel sat alone one night in his office, staring at the map of Europe pinned to the wall. The red dots were his clients. The lines between them were the courier's routes. He saw the network. His network. Small, fragile, but already real. And he saw how war was flowing through this network. Letter after letter, number after number, The Armada was destroyed in August. The storm and the English fire ships had accomplished what diplomats could not. Half the Spanish fleet lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Europe breathed a sigh of relief. But Daniel didn't, because he saw something in the metadata that journalists and diplomats hadn't seen. The correspondence between Paris and Madrid hadn't decreased. It had increased. The war wasn't over. It had shifted to the page. In France, a war of its own was smoldering. The three Henrys. Henry III, King of France. Henry de Guise, head of the Catholic League. Henry of Navarre, a Protestant and pretender to the throne. All three sides were writing, to everyone, constantly. And two of the three were already clients of people who were clients of Daniel's. The chain was getting longer. Daniel couldn't grow as fast as the circumstances demanded. He had 4 people. 4 for the entire network. Annika, Maggie, Johann, Isabel. Each of them was working at their limit, and each of them was irreplaceable. Losing any one of them meant a hole that couldn't be patched. He needed a 5th link. Someone outside Antwerp. Someone in another city. Someone who could be his eyes and hands where he himself couldn't reach. Venice. A crossroads. A place where East meets West. Where Ottoman merchants traded with Genoese bankers. Where the Council of 10 maintained Europe's oldest intelligence service. Daniel knew he needed someone in Venice. But to find such a person from Antwerp, 1,000 miles away, without a single acquaintance in the city, it seemed impossible. And then, Isabel placed a letter in front of him. She'd received it from an acquaintance from her past life, a friend from her old social circle. Hidden between the lines of chatter about fashion and the weather was a request. A young woman in Venice needed help, an orphan from the Jewish ghetto. She spoke many languages, she was smart, lonely, and with absolutely no prospects. Her name is Rosa Levy. She is 19 years old. Daniel read the letter twice. Then he looked at Isabel. Isabel said she didn't know this girl personally, but she trusts the person who wrote about her. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. Then he made a decision. He wouldn't go himself. He couldn't leave the office. He would send a letter, through his network, of course, encrypted, with a job offer, and a test. He composed a message to Rosa Levy. It consisted of 3 parts. The first part was written in plain text in Italian, a job offer. Courier and translation services, good pay. The second part was encrypted using a simple substitution cipher, instructions for arriving in Antwerp, the contact person's name, the address. The third part was encrypted more complexly, much more complexly. No key, no instructions, just a set of numbers. Daniel wanted to see what she would do. If she read only the first part and came, she was literate, but nothing more. If she deciphered the second part, she was smart and persistent. If she deciphered the third part, then she was exactly the person he needed. The letter was sent via the Fugger couriers through Milan and Padua all the way to Venice. 6 weeks, one way. Daniel waited. The reply from Venice arrived 11 weeks later, not 6, as Daniel had expected. 11. He had already begun to think that the letter hadn't arrived, or that Rosa Levy wasn't interested, or that she was dead. In Venice, a Jewish orphan girl could have died from a dozen causes, none of which would have made it into the news. But in the 11th week, Maggie brought a package from Brussels, delivered to her by a Fugger courier at a transit point. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first sheet contained the decryption of the second part of his letter. Flawless. The contact's name, the office address. Everything was correct. The second sheet contained the decryption of the third part, that very one. Without a key, without instructions. A set of numbers that Daniel had encrypted using a method based on the Fibonacci sequence, a method that didn't exist in that era. Rosa Levy decrypted it. Not completely. She found a pattern in the first 20 digits. She figured out the principle, and from there, she followed it, reconstructing the text block by block. She made 4 mistakes in 40 words, but she made it to the end. The text of the third part stated that if the recipient was able to read this, she should come to Antwerp in person and that all travel expenses would be reimbursed. Below the decryption, Rosa added a single line in Italian. She wrote that she had made 4 mistakes and knew exactly where they were, but chose not to correct them so that he could see her train of thought. Daniel read that line and placed the sheet on the table. Then he stood up. He walked over to the window. He stood there for a minute. He sat back down. He read it again. This 19-year-old girl from the Venetian ghetto hadn't just solved the problem he considered nearly unsolvable without a hint. She had solved it and left the mistakes in on purpose, to show the process, so that he could evaluate not only the result, but also the method. This was the mindset not of a cryptographer, but of an engineer. Rosa Levy arrived in Antwerp at the end of October. She came alone, with a single bag. The bag contained a change of clothes and 7 books. 7 books in 4 languages. She entered the office and paused in the doorway. Petite, thin. Her dark hair was tucked under a simple bonnet. Her eyes were black and quick. They swept across the room like the hands of a clock, noting every detail. The desk, the inkwells, the chest in the corner, the door to the back room, the window, the latch on the window. She took it all in 3 seconds. Daniel stood up from the table. She looked at him. Then she said in flawless English that the error in the 23rd word had been intentional on his part. He had inserted an extra character to see if she would notice the glitch in the sequence. Daniel blinked. He had indeed inserted an extra character. He hadn't expected her to notice it, especially since she'd made 4 mistakes of her own. But she had distinguished between her own mistakes and his trap. She knew where she had erred and where he had. Daniel invited her to sit down. Rosa sat down. She wasn't nervous. She was observing. He asked how many languages she spoke. She began to list them. Italian was her native language, Hebrew, Ladino, and Portuguese from the community, Latin from the rabbi who had taught her father, French from merchants, German from pilgrims, English from sailors, Arabic from Ottoman merchants at the port. She'd learned Dutch on the way to Antwerp, a 3-week journey. She already understood simple phrases, 8 languages fluently, 3 at a reading level. Daniel listened and counted in his head. 8 languages, at 19 years old, raised on the streets, without a formal education, just by listening and memorizing. He asked if it was true that she remembered everything she had read. Rosa said she remembered, word for word, everything she had read or heard over the past 10 years. Not approximately, word for word. A page of text read just once stays in her head forever. She said this without pride, as a fact, as if she were saying she had black hair. Daniel realized he hadn't found a courier or a translator. He'd found a living database. A person whose mind could store keys that were too dangerous to write down on paper. A person who could memorize a code book of 1,000 words after reading it just once and reproduce it a year later without a single mistake. He offered her 20 guilders a month, housing, food, and a job that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Rosa accepted. without haggling, without asking for details. She said only one thing. She said that for the first time in her life, someone had offered her a job based on what she could do, not on what she looked like. It took 3 months to train Rosa. Not because she was a slow learner, she remembered everything the first time. But Daniel took his time. He taught her layer by layer. First, simple ciphers, then variable keys, then control markers, then behavioral protocols, how to destroy a draft, how to pass on a key, what to say if asked what she does, how to behave under surveillance. Rosa absorbed it all and added her own touches. In the second week of training, she proposed a modification to the control marker. Instead of a simple remainder from division, use 2 markers. One calculated based on the first half of the letter, the second for the second half. If someone swapped out a fragment in the middle, both markers would break. Daniel looked at her. She had just independently invented a primitive version of block integrity checking, without a textbook, without a computer, using pure logic. He accepted her proposal and implemented it for all clients. 3 months later, Rosa was ready. Daniel laid out his plan for her. She would return to Venice. There she would open a branch of the House of Trusted Letters. Formally, it would be a translation agency. In reality, she would become his eyes and hands on the Adriatic. She would encrypt the correspondence of Venetian clients. She would maintain her own metadata log and send him reports every 2 weeks via the Fugger courier network. Rosa listened. Then she asked one question. She asked if he trusted her. Not her intellect, not her memory, him. Daniel paused. Then he said he did. Rosa stood up. She looked down at him. She was a head shorter than him, but at that moment, it seemed the other way around. She said that in that case, she wouldn't let him down. And she called him Mr. Ashcroft, with emphasis, with something in her voice that Daniel couldn't quite put his finger on. Annika, standing in the doorway of the back room, recognized it instantly. She later told Daniel that the girl was in love with him. Daniel said it didn't matter. Annika looked at him for a long time. Then she turned away and said nothing. Rosa left for Venice in January 1589. She took with her the code book she had memorized. Not a single sheet of paper. Everything was in her head. If they stopped her, searched her, or interrogated her, they wouldn't find a thing. Because you can't search someone else's memory. Daniel stood by the window and watched as a small figure in a dark coat got into a carriage heading south. He had sent a 19-year-old girl alone across half of Europe to a city where she had no protection, no patron, and no name. He did it because he needed someone in Venice, and because he had no one better. He hated himself for it, and he knew he would do it again. Venice replied 6 weeks later. Rosa had arrived. She rented a room in the Cannaregio district, not far from the ghetto. She found work as a translator at one of the trading houses on the Rialto. Her first report was brief and precise. She described the structure of the Venetian postal system, the names of the 4 main courier offices, rates, routes, weak points. The main weakness was that the Council of 10 maintained its own secret office, a group of people whose sole task was to open other people's letters, read them, copy them, and reseal them so that the recipient would not notice. The Venetian secret office had been operating for 100 years. They were the best in Europe. Better than the English, better than the Spanish. They read everything. Daniel read Rosa's report and smirked. Let them read. They wouldn't be able to read his letters. And that, more than anything else, would catch their attention. He was right. 3 months after the Venice branch opened, Rosa sent an alarming report. She was being followed. 2 of them. They weren't rude. They weren't noticeable to the casual observer. But Rosa had grown up in a ghetto where survival depended on the ability to spot those following you. She described them. A man in his 40s dressed like a craftsman. A young man of about 25 who pretended to be selling fish on the same canal where she rented a room. He had the same fish for 3 days in a row. The Council of 10. Daniel wasn't afraid. He'd been expecting this. The question was how to use Venice's attention, not how to hide from it. He wrote Rosa a set of instructions. Long, detailed. She was to continue working as usual, not to hide, not to change her routes, but to start doing something new. She was to quietly and unobtrusively let the trading house on the Rialto know that her translation services also included ensuring the confidentiality of correspondence. Not to push it, just drop a hint. Tell a story. Mention the case of the Antwerp merchant whose spy was caught not by a search, but by mathematics. Rosa carried out the instructions flawlessly. A month later, she had 2 clients. Minor ones, a glass merchant and a ship owner, but they were clients nonetheless. And the Council of 10 saw that a man had appeared in their city whose clients had suddenly stopped fearing interception. At the same time as the Venetian affairs, an event occurred in Antwerp that Daniel hadn't foreseen. He was nearly killed. Not pretty, not romantic. Stupid. He was walking home from the office one evening through the alley behind St. Andrew's Church, a short route he took every day. He had broken his own rule. A predictable route is a vulnerability. He knew that. He'd taught others that. And yet he'd been taking the same route for half a year. 2 men stepped out of the darkness, one in front, one behind. The one in front had a knife. They didn't want his wallet. The one in front said he wanted the keys to the office, and a book with numbers. So they knew. Not exactly, roughly. They knew there was something valuable, books with codes. They didn't know that the books were useless without the keys, but they knew enough to come after them. Daniel wasn't a fighter. He'd never fought, not in this life nor in the last. But he had one advantage. He wasn't carrying anything of value. Annika had the keys to the office. The book with the numbers was in an iron chest secured with 3 locks, the keys to which were held by 3 different people. He couldn't open that chest on his own. He told his attackers that he didn't have what they were looking for. The one in front stabbed him in the stomach with the hilt of a knife. Daniel doubled over. The pain was sharp and burning. The one behind grabbed him by the collar and searched him. He found a wallet with 3 stevers. He laughed. Then he struck again, in the ribs. Daniel fell. They searched him again. Nothing. The one in front cursed, and they left. Daniel lay on the wet rocks, gasping for breath. A rib was broken. Or cracked. He couldn't tell, but breathing hurt. He crawled to the office. Annika opened the door and saw him. She didn't scream. She dragged him inside, sat him down on a bench, and began washing his scrapes. Her hands were steady. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. Daniel told her what had happened. Annika listened in silence. Then she said one word. She said it wasn't a robbery, but a hit. Daniel nodded. He knew. Robbers don't ask for keys and books with numbers. Someone had sent those 2. Someone who knew what the office did, but didn't know exactly how the system worked. He needed to find out who. But not now. Right now, there was something more important to do. The next morning, despite the pain in his ribs, Daniel spent 4 hours rewriting the office's security protocols. He forbade himself and every employee from taking the same route 2 days in a row. The keys to the office were distributed among 3 people, none of whom could open all the locks on their own. All drafts were destroyed the same day. The ink used for the keys was different from the ink used for regular letters. If someone broke into the office and grabbed the papers, they wouldn't be able to tell a letter draft from a key draft. But Annika could. By the smell of the ink. Maggie was ordered to always carry 2 envelopes, one real, one fake. She herself didn't know which was which, because Annika sealed both and handed them to her without saying which was the real one. Only the recipient could tell the difference, by the tracking marker inside. Daniel sat at the table with a rag wrapped around his ribs and wrote. Johann stood nearby, silently. Finally, he said that whoever had sent those men would try again. Daniel replied that he knew. Johann said that next time, someone more dangerous than a knife might come. Daniel replied that he knew that too. Johann was silent for a moment. Then he said that he had lived 41 years in this world and had spent 20 of them in prayer. And in those 20 years of prayer, the only thing he truly regretted was that he hadn't protected those he was supposed to protect when he could have. He said nothing more, but Daniel understood. Johann wasn't going anywhere. 2 weeks later, Isabel found the person who had ordered the hit, not through interrogations, not through surveillance, through people. She questioned the innkeeper whose tavern stood in the alley behind St. Andrew's Church. The innkeeper had seen 2 men. They'd been drinking at his place 2 hours before the attack. One of them had paid with a coin that Isabel asked to see. A Spanish real, not an Antwerp coin. A Spanish one. Isabel traced the chain of events back a week. The 2 mercenaries were from the Port District. They were hired by a man who received money from a Flemish middleman. The middleman worked for a trading house in Brussels. The trading house had ties to the Spanish administration in the Netherlands. The Spaniards, not the crown, not intelligence. Not intelligence, at least not yet. Most likely some mid-level bureaucrat who had noticed the office and decided to curry favor by uncovering its secrets. Small fry. But small fry swim alongside the big fish. Daniel didn't seek revenge. He didn't report it to the magistrate. He did something more effective. He waited 3 months. Over the course of those 3 months, he learned the official's name through Hasselt. Marcos de Valdez, a low-level secretary with the Spanish administration in Brussels. A man with debts and ambitions. Daniel waited another month. And then he arranged for Valdez to receive an anonymous offer. Services to protect confidential correspondence. On behalf of a firm that Valdez could not connect to the attack 3 months earlier. Because the offer had come through 3 intermediaries, none of whom knew the source. Valdez agreed. He became a client. The man who had tried to rob Daniel was now paying him 20 guilders a month to protect his own letters. And he didn't know who he was dealing with. Daniel never told anyone about this, except for Annika. Annika listened, and for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she smiled so that he could see her teeth. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a woman who realized that her master was playing at a level she didn't fully understand. And that she liked it. The year 1589 changed France forever. Henry III had ordered the assassination of the Duke of Guise in December of the previous year. And in August of 1589, a monk named Jacques Clément plunged a knife into the king's own stomach. The throne passed to Henry of War, a Protestant. Half of France refused to recognize him. The Catholic League declared war. Paris closed its gates. Spain intervened. Daniel read the metadata and watched as Europe was being redrawn in real time. Correspondence between Paris and Madrid exploded. Between Rome and Brussels, too. The papal nuncio in Paris wrote 4 letters a week to the Vatican. The Fuggers began withdrawing money from France. Their couriers passed through Antwerp every 3 days. Rosa's Venetian branch detected a sharp increase in correspondence between Venice and Constantinople. The Ottomans watched the European chaos with barely concealed interest. The office's workload tripled in half a year. Daniel worked himself to the bone. Annika worked herself to the point of exhaustion. Maggie had worn out 2 horses and bought a third. Johann started a second metadata logbook because the first one had run out of space. And at this moment of peak tension in Antwerp, news arrived that made Daniel feel genuine fear for the first time in 2 years. One of his couriers had been killed. Not Maggie's. A young man named Jan, whom Maggie had hired 2 months ago for the Antwerp-Ghent route. He was found on the side of the road outside Dendermonde. His throat had been slit. His bag was empty. Maggie brought the news herself. She stood in the office, her face ashen. Her hands were clenched into fists. She said that Jan was a good guy, that he had a mother in Ghent, that he'd driven that route 12 times without incident. Daniel listened and counted the losses, not just the human ones. Jan was carrying 2 packages. One was fake and one was real. The killers took both. They didn't know which one was real, but they had time to figure it out. Inside the real package was a letter for the Ghent merchant, encrypted with the current key. The key changed every 2 weeks. There were 4 days left until the next change. Daniel had to deliver the new key to the Ghent client via an alternative route within 4 days. Otherwise, the intercepted letter would become vulnerable. Not immediately, and not guaranteed. But theoretically, if the interceptor had a good mathematician and worked on the letter continuously for 4 days, he could make progress. Daniel sent Maggie to Ghent that very night, with the new keys sewn into the saddle pad. Maggie didn't ask why. She left. 2 days later, she returned. The key had been delivered. The old system was deactivated. The new one was activated. The vulnerability was closed. But the man was dead. Daniel sat alone in his office at night. A candle burned. The shadow of his hand lay on the table. Jan was dead because he had worked for him. Because Daniel had built a system that attracted people who wanted to break it. And these people were willing to slit a 20-year-old guy's throat on the side of the road for the contents of a leather bag. He could walk away from it all. Close the office, leave, start a quiet life somewhere. He was a cryptographer. He could have made a living in any European city simply by transcribing other people's letters. But he couldn't walk away. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't anymore. Annika depended on the office. Maggie depended on the office. Rosa in Venice depended on the office. Johann found a purpose at the office that he hadn't found in 20 years of monastic life. Isabel found a place where her mind was valued rather than exploited. People. Always people. They were both his strength and his weakness. He clenched his fists. Then he unclenched them. Then he began to think. He needed to find out who had killed Jan. Not for revenge, for safety. If someone was hunting his couriers, that meant someone knew the routes. That meant there was a leak, or surveillance, or both. He brought Isabel in. She worked for a week. She asked questions. She listened. She pieced things together. And she found out. The murder wasn't ordered by a Spaniard, or an Englishman. The client was a Flemish merchant named Cornelius de Munk, an arms dealer. A man who sold muskets to both sides of the Dutch revolt, and for whom it was critically important that his correspondence with the Spanish side remain secret. De Munk wasn't Daniel's client, but his competitor was. And de Munk decided it was easier to kill the courier and read someone else's letters than to hire his own cryptographer. Daniel learned the name and remained silent for 3 days. Maggie wanted to go see Demunk. She didn't say why, but Daniel could see it in her eyes. He said no. Isabel suggested passing the information on to the magistrate. Daniel said no. Johann said that the murderer must answer to God or to the people. Daniel said he would answer, but not now. He waited 4 months. Over the course of 4 months, Demunk decrypted the contents of the intercepted package. Or rather, he thought he had decrypted it, because the real package didn't contain a letter to the Ghent merchant. That, too, was a trap. Daniel had started using a system of triple packages after Jan's death. 1 fake, 1 decoy with plausible but false contents, and 1 real one, hidden not in a bag, but sewn into the courier's clothing. A bag can be taken away. It's harder to search the latter if you don't know what to look for. Demunk decoded the decoy package. Inside was false information about an arms shipment that his competitor was supposedly planning. Demunk believed it. He made a countermove. And he fell for it. The Spanish arrested him, not for the courier's murder, for attempting to intercept the Crown's arms contract. Demunk was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Daniel didn't tell Maggie about it. She found out on her own. She came to the office that evening. She stood there in silence. Then she said one sentence. She said he was a terrible person, but a good one. Daniel didn't answer. He stared at the candle and thought about Jan. About the 20-year-old guy from Ghent who had a mother, whom he'd hired, who had been killed because he worked for a man whose letters someone wanted to read. That was the price. The first price paid not by him, but by someone close to him. And he knew it wouldn't be the last. A week after Demunk's arrest, a letter arrived at the office from Venice. From Rosa. She wrote that the Council of 10 had finally made its move. They hadn't come to her with threats. They'd sent a client, a wealthy Venetian merchant who wanted to hire her to encrypt his correspondence with Constantinople. The merchant was a front. Rosa realized this immediately. The offer was too generous. There were too few questions about the price. Real merchants haggle down to the last staver. This one didn't haggle. The Council of 10 wanted to plant their man inside Rosa's system, a classic recruitment ploy using a front client. Rosa asked what to do. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. Then he wrote his reply. Accept. Accept the front man. Give him the system. The real, working system. But with one addition, a separate set of keys, a separate code book, isolated from all other clients. Let the Council of 10 see how the system works. Let them study it. Let them try to break it. They won't be able to. And when they can't, they'll realize that fighting it is pointless. And then they'll come, not with a front client, but with a real offer. Rosa followed the instructions. She accepted the merchant. She gave him the system. And she waited. Daniel was waiting too. He knew how to wait better than anyone else in the world, because he knew what they didn't know. He knew how this game would end. He would win. Not because he was smarter, but because he had a 400-year head start. Winter of 1590, a year and a half after Jan's death. The office on Kammerstraat had expanded from 2 rooms to 4. Daniel had bought out the entire second floor above the bookbinder's shop. 16 clients, 3 courier routes. The Venetian branch was operating steadily. The office's income had surpassed 600 guilders a month. Serious money. Money that made it possible to hire staff, expand, and buy the best horses and the best paper. But money that also attracted serious people and serious problems. The problem came from Spain, not in the form of mercenaries on a dark street, in the form of a single man. His name was Gaspar de Leon. Daniel first heard that name when Lindner from the Fugger household paid an unusual visit to the office. Lindner never smiled, but that day his face was even more impassive than usual. He placed a sheet of paper on the table, an intercepted letter from El Escorial, not encrypted using Daniel's system, encrypted with the Spanish royal cipher. The Fuggers had intercepted it through their own channels. They had decrypted it through their contact at court. And this letter mentioned the House of Faithful Letters, not by name, but by description. The author of the letter reported that an office was operating in Antwerp a new type of encryption service, that the intercepted samples had been forwarded to the Crown's best cryptographer for analysis, that the analysis had been ongoing for 6 months and had yet to yield any results, and that the cryptographer was requesting that more samples and the name of the office's owner be sent to him. The author of the letter recommended taking the matter seriously. He used a word that Lindner translated as unprecedented. The Spanish Crown's best cryptographer. Daniel asked for his name. Lindner said the letter did not specify a name, but based on the description, he was a man from Salamanca, a mathematician and linguist, working in the Escorial Tower. Daniel nodded. He didn't know this man, not from history, not from textbooks. Gaspar de Leon hadn't made it into the annals of cryptography. Perhaps because he had lost. Perhaps because he had won, and his name had been classified. In any case, he was real now. And he had been struggling with Daniel's ciphers for 6 months, and he hadn't given up. That was important. 99% of cryptographers of that era would have given up after a month. They would have decided the cipher was too complex or that the intercepted samples were corrupted. But this one hadn't given up. 6 months, every day, alone, in the tower. This was no ordinary specialist. This was a man possessed. Daniel sat down at his desk and, for the first time in a long while, felt what he would have called professional respect in a past life. Somewhere in Spain sat a man who was trying to break his system, not with brute force, but with his mind. And although this man could not defeat him mathematically, Daniel knew about people of this type. They don't stop at mathematics. If they can't crack the code, they start breaking the person. He had to be prepared. He gathered everyone: Annika, Maggie, Johann, Isabel, Cecilia Show. Cecilia. She'd shown up at the office 3 months ago and deserved a story of her own. The daughter of a Korean translator brought to Europe by the Jesuits from Macau as an exotic specialist. Her father had died in Lisbon. Cecilia was left alone, 24 years old. A face that made every passerby stop and look back. Not because of her beauty, because she was so out of the ordinary. An Asian woman in Antwerp in 1590. She was a curiosity, an exhibit. She was invited to dinners so she could be shown off to guests. People asked her questions the way they ask a parrot questions. Is it true that in China they eat with chopsticks? Is it true that there is no God there? She smiled and answered, and she hated every second of it. Daniel found her through Isabel. Or rather, Isabel found her at one of those dinners. She came back and told Daniel that she'd seen a woman who remembered all 20 guests by name, and, the next day, recounted word for word 3 conversations that had taken place simultaneously at different ends of the table. Daniel met with her. They talked for 2 hours. He spoke little. She spoke a lot. For the first time in her life, someone listened to her not as a curiosity, but as a human being. He asked if it was true that she remembered everything. She said she remembered every day starting from the age of 4. Every face, every word, every smell. Her brain didn't know how to forget. It wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. Because she also remembered the things she wished she could forget. But that was exactly what Daniel needed. A living key bank. Cecilia memorized code books. She didn't write them down. She memorized them. One code book contained 300 or 500 word number pairs. Cecilia could store 20 such books in her head at the same time and reproduce any of them a year later. Daniel stopped writing down critical keys on paper. They existed only in Cecilia's head. If the office were robbed, burned down, or every sheet of paper confiscated, the keys would remain. In the mind of a woman whom no one took seriously. Now Daniel was sitting in front of all 5 of them: Annika, Maggie, Johann, Isabel, Cecilia. He told them about the letter from the Escorial, about the man who had been trying to crack their code for 6 months, about how, sooner or later, this man would move from paper to people. He said that any one of them could become a target, that each of them might be bribed, intimidated, kidnapped, or killed, and that from this day forward, each of them must remember 3 rules. First, no one walks alone after dark. Second, no one discusses the office's work with anyone outside this room. Third, if any of them are captured and interrogated, they must tell the truth, the whole truth that they know. This was neither a sacrifice nor an act of heroism. It was an engineering solution. The system is designed so that everyone knows only their own part. Maggie knows the roots, but doesn't know the keys. Annika knows the structure, but doesn't know the contents of the letters. Cecilia knows the keys, but doesn't know who they belong to. Johann knows the metadata, but doesn't know the messages themselves. Isabel knows the people, but doesn't know the math. Even if all 5 were interrogated and all 5 told everything they knew, not a single interrogator would be able to piece together the full picture. Because the full picture existed only in one mind, in Daniel's mind. They listened in silence. No one asked a single question. No one objected. Maggie was the first to nod. Annika followed. Then Isabel, Johann. Cecilia was the last to nod. She looked at Daniel for a long time. And for the first time, Daniel saw something in her eyes other than professional composure. She looked at him as if she saw more than he was letting on, as if she knew something she wasn't supposed to know. She didn't say anything, but Daniel remembered that look. Far away in Spain, Gaspar de Leon sat in the tower of El Escorial. On the table in front of him lay 32 intercepted letters encrypted using Daniel's system. 6 months of work, not a single breakthrough. Frequency analysis wasn't working. No repeating patterns, no predictable positions. Each letter seemed to have been encrypted anew, from scratch, with a different key. Gaspar knew what that meant. He knew, in theory, that if a new key were used for every message, frequency analysis would be useless. He himself had described this principle in his treatise 5 years ago, as a hypothesis, as a theoretical possibility. He had considered it impractical. Too many keys, too difficult to transmit, too many points of failure. And now, lying before him, were 32 pieces of evidence that someone had done it. Someone had turned theory into practice. Gaspar stood up. He walked over to the window. He looked at the sunset over Castile. Then he quietly said aloud that he would find him. He didn't know his name. He didn't know his face. He didn't know his city. But he knew that somewhere in Europe lived a man who thought in a way that no one else in this century did. And this man was either the greatest genius or the greatest enigma? Gasper was going to find out which it was. Cecilia Sho joined the team as a living keybank, capable of storing 20 codebooks in her memory at the same time. From an intercepted letter from the Fuggers, Daniel learned that Spain's best cryptographer, Gaspar de Ley, had been trying unsuccessfully for 6 months to break his ciphers. Daniel assembled the entire team and implemented security protocols based on the principle of shared knowledge, so that even if all 5 were interrogated, the complete system would not be revealed. The spring of 1590 brought silence to the office. Not a peaceful silence, a tense one. The silence before the storm. Daniel could sense it in the metadata. Correspondence between El Escorial and Brussels had dropped by 1/3 in a month. That was a bad sign. When diplomats fall silent, it means a decision has been made, and it is no longer pens but hands that are at work. Johann was the first to notice it. He came to Daniel in the morning and placed his book in front of him, open to a page with a frequency chart. 3 lines: Madrid, Brussels, Madrid, Rome, Madrid, Paris. All 3 had dropped simultaneously, as if someone at the Escorial had turned off the tap. Daniel looked at the graph and thought. Then he asked Johann exactly when the drop had begun. Johann answered precisely, March 14th. Daniel mentally rewound the events. What had happened on March 14th? Nothing public. Not a single event that all of Antwerp would be talking about. But Lindner from the Fuggers had mentioned in passing that a new advisor from Madrid had arrived in Brussels in mid-March. He didn't give a name. He only said that the man had arrived on a personal mission, and that even the Fugger informants at court didn't know the details. Daniel cross-referenced the dates. March 14th. The arrival of the unknown advisor. The drop in correspondence volume. He brought Isabel in. A week later, she came back with the results. The advisor from Madrid was staying not at the Spanish governor's residence, but in a private house on the outskirts of Brussels. The house belonged to the Hieronymite monastery. The advisor did not attend receptions. He did not meet with diplomats. He did not visit the chancellery. The only person with whom he had contact was the Spanish governor's secretary, who was responsible for intercepting correspondence. Daniel felt a chill. Not fear, recognition. Gaspar de Leon had come in person. He had left his tower. He had left the Escorial. He had come to the Netherlands in person. This meant that the hunt for documents was over. The hunt for a man was beginning. Daniel assembled a team that very evening. He didn't try to hide the situation. He said that the Spanish cryptographer was in Brussels, that he hadn't come here for the correspondence itself, but for the person behind it. Maggie asked if it wasn't time to leave. Daniel said that running away was impossible. The firm wasn't just him. It was the clients, the roots, the reputation. If he ran away, everything would fall apart within a week, and everyone in this room would be left unprotected, face to face with people who slit couriers' throats on the side of the road. They couldn't run. They had to play the game. Daniel had gone 2 days without sleep. He'd been reviewing every element of the system, every route, every contact, every point where his network touched the outside world. He was looking for a weakness, something through which Gaspar could get to him. And he found it. Hasselt, the Flemish middleman through whom the Spanish correspondence passed. Hasselt knew Daniel by sight, knew his name, knew the office address. If Gaspar started pulling on the Spanish threads, he'd track down Hasselt within a week. And under pressure, Hasselt would spill everything. Daniel had to decide what to do with Hasselt. Removing him from the chain was impossible without losing the Spanish contract. Warning him would mean exposing the Fuggers' source of information. Daniel chose a third option. He went to see Hasselt himself, for the first time since they'd begun working together. Hasselt lived in a lavish house on the Mayor. He received Daniel in his study at the dining table. Daniel didn't beat around the bush. He told Hasselt that the Spanish crown had sent someone to Brussels who was intercepting correspondence. He didn't say how he knew. He said that this threatened the security of Hasselt's personal correspondence, and that from that day on, all communication between them would follow a new protocol. No face-to-face meetings, no visits to the office, all letters through a double intermediary. Hasselt wasn't thrilled, but he was a merchant. He understood the risks. He agreed. Daniel returned to the office and began the second phase. He wrote to Rosa in Venice, an urgent letter.
He asked her to find out everything she could about Gaspar de Leon through her informants. His background, his habits, weaknesses, connections, who he loves, who he hates, what he fears. Rosa replied 4 weeks later. Her sources in Jesuit circles knew about Gaspar. 43 years old, unmarried, from an impoverished noble family, studied in Salamanca, was a student of the great cryptographer Luis de Velasco, had worked at court for 20 years, deciphered the correspondence of the French ambassador in Madrid in the year 83, deciphered the correspondence of the rebellious Dutch provinces with England in 1885. He was considered the best, unsurpassed, obsessed. Rosa added a detail of her own. Gaspar de Leon had never once in his life admitted defeat, in any matter. Every cipher he took on, he saw through to the end, without exception, even if it took years. He didn't know how to stop. Daniel read the dossier and realized something important. Gaspar wasn't his enemy in the usual sense. He didn't want to destroy Daniel out of malice or political calculation. He wanted to understand how a system that shouldn't exist actually worked. For Gaspar, this wasn't a mission for the crown. It was personal, intellectual, almost religious. He couldn't live in a world where a code existed that he couldn't crack. That made him dangerous, and that made him predictable, because a man possessed by a single-minded obsession moves straight ahead. He doesn't veer off course. He doesn't compromise, doesn't stop. He keeps going until he reaches his goal or collapses. And Daniel knew what he had to do. Not run away from Gaspar, not hide. Guide him. Give him a path to follow. A long one, a winding one, leading exactly where Daniel needed him to go. He began leaving clues. The clues were subtle. Daniel left nothing obvious, nothing that looked like planted evidence. He left gaps, small imperfections in the wall that could only be noticed if one was specifically looking for them. The first clue? He altered the route of one of the couriers so that it would pass through Mechelen, past the tavern that, according to Isabel, was frequented by people in the Spanish governor's inner circle. The courier was carrying an ordinary package, but the accompanying note on the outside of the package, which wasn't encrypted, listed the sender's name. Not Daniel's. A made-up name.
An English one. Robert Hartley. Daniel was creating a decoy. The second clue. 2 weeks later, another courier accidentally dropped a scrap of paper in a Brussels tavern. The scrap had numbers on it, meaningless to anyone, but not to a cryptographer. To a cryptographer, it was a fragment of a key table, an old one that was no longer in use, but authentic in structure. A fragment that confirmed that the system existed and that it was organized exactly as Gaspar had suspected. Rotating keys, substitution tables, regular rotation. The third clue. Through a chain of acquaintances,
Isabel spread a rumor in Antwerp's English-speaking circles. An English clerk named Robert Hartley works for several trading houses at the same time. Strange, reserved, lives alone, writes a lot, spends money on paper and ink. Gaspar had to piece together all three clues: the name on the package, a fragment of the key at the tavern, the rumor about the reclusive Englishman. 3 dots, 1 line, leading to a man who didn't exist. Daniel waited. 6 weeks. Nothing happened. In the 7th week, Maggie brought news from Brussels.
Someone had been asking around at the port offices about Robert Hartley. Systematically, methodically, professionally. The fish took the bait. Daniel intensified his investigation. He rented a room in Antwerp on the other side of town from Kammerstraat, in Robert Hartley's name. He paid for 3 months in advance. He placed several sheets of paper covered in numbers on the table in the room. Drafts. Fake. But to a cryptographer, they looked like working notes. He left traces of life in the room. A mug, a candle stub, a raincoat on a hook. The room looked like the home of a man who had stepped out for a short while and would be back soon. Then he left and never returned. He waited. 3 weeks later, Isabel reported that someone had searched Hartley's room. Carefully, professionally. The drafts were taken. The raincoat remained. The mug stood in the same spot. The search was so thorough that an ordinary person wouldn't have noticed a thing. But Daniel had left 3 telltale marks: a thread in a specific position on the table, a drop of wax on the window hinge, a scratch on the lock that would change if the lock were picked. All 3 markers had been tampered with. That meant Gaspar, or his people, had found the room. They'd found the drafts. And now they were poring over them in their Brussels hideout, trying to figure out the system from the fragments Daniel had fed them. The drafts were genuine in form, but false in content. They described an encryption system similar to Daniel's real one, but with one critical difference. The fake system had a vulnerability. A beautiful one. An elegant one. A vulnerability that a genius like Gaspar would discover after 2 or 3 months of work. And when he did, he would believe he had cracked Daniel's code. And he would start reading the letters that Daniel would write specifically for him. Daniel sat in his office and smiled. He was setting a trap for a man who had been hunting people his whole life. And the trap was made of the only material against which Gaspar had no defense: his own talent. Because it was precisely that talent that would force him to find the vulnerability. It was precisely that talent that would convince him he had won. And it was precisely that talent that would blind him. While Daniel played chess with Gaspar, the real world kept turning. France was ablaze. Henry of Navarre was laying siege to Paris. Spanish troops were marching to the aid of the Catholic League. The Pope was issuing papal bulls. The Fuggers were counting their losses. And they were all writing. To everyone. Via couriers who were robbed on the roads. With ciphers that were cracked in a single evening. With seals that were forged in an hour. Except for Daniel's clients. Their letters reached their destination. Their orders were carried out. Their money was transferred accurately and without loss. Word of the firm spread across Europe slowly but inexorably. Not through advertising, through results. Every client who hadn't lost a letter told 2 others about it. Every banker whose deal went through without a leak mentioned Ashcroft's name at a private dinner. In April 1590, a man arrived in Antwerp from the Venetian ambassador to the French court. The Council of 10 had finally made a real move. Not a front client, a genuine proposal. Venice wanted to use Daniel's system for its diplomatic correspondence, through Rosa, through the Venetian branch,
on terms dictated not by the council, but by Daniel. This was a turning point. Venice wasn't asking, Venice was acknowledging. It acknowledged that its own secret service, which had been operating for 100 years, had been unable to break the cipher created in a small office on Kommerstraat. Daniel accepted the offer, on his own terms. Rosa in Venice attained a status she could never have dreamed of. She became the cipher clerk of the most serene republic. Formally. In reality, she remained Daniel's agent. Dual loyalty. Dangerous. But the only way to maintain control. By the summer of 1990, Daniel was serving England, Spain through an intermediary, Venice, the Fuggers, and 12 private clients. No party knew of the others. He sat at the center of the web, and the web began to hum with every move made by every king in Europe. That evening, Johann brought him the latest metadata report. Daniel looked at the numbers and, for the first time, saw not a stream of letters, but a map of power. He knew who was talking to whom, how often. What exactly he didn't know, but that didn't matter. The structure said it all. He knew that Henry of Navarre had sent a secret envoy to Rome 3 weeks before the journalists found out about it. He knew that the Fuggers had withdrawn money from Lyon 2 weeks before the French bank announced a delay in payments. He knew that the English had stepped up their correspondence with the Dutch rebels a month before the new offensive. He didn't read the letters. He read the rhythm. And the rhythm told him everything. And for the first time, he thought that perhaps he could not only read, but also influence. Not through words, through time. Delay one letter by a day. Speed up another by 2 days. A trifle, imperceptible, but enough for one side to learn the news a day earlier than the other. A day in politics is an eternity. He hadn't done it yet, but he was already thinking about it every evening, as he fell asleep on his narrow bed in the room behind the office. He did it in September, his first intervention. Not a big deal, not historic, just a small one. 2 Protestant principalities on the Rhine, the Palatinate and Württemberg, both clients of the Fuggers. Both used Daniel's system for their banking correspondence. A conflict was brewing between them over customs duties on the Rhine Bridge. A trifle for the empire. A tragedy for 2 small states that could not afford a war. Daniel saw the conflict in the metadata a month before it became public. The frequency of letters between Heidelberg and Stuttgart had quadrupled. He didn't know the tone of the letters, but he knew the frequency, and that frequency pointed to a growing crisis. Then he spotted a third line, from Heidelberg to Madrid. The Elector Palatine was writing to the Spanish, asking for support. Or he was proposing a deal, or he was asking for money for a war with a neighbor. In any case, if Spain intervened in the minor conflict on the Rhine, it would cease to be minor. Daniel made his decision in a single night. The letter from Heidelberg to Madrid traveled via the Antwerp route through his courier. He did not open it. He did not read it. He did not tamper with it. He held it up for a day. A full day. The courier's horse limped near Mechelen. He lost a day. He arrived late. During that day, Württemberg sent a letter to Heidelberg proposing a compromise. A letter that traveled via a different courier, not Daniel's. A coincidence? Or perhaps not. Because Daniel knew about the Württemberg letter from Rosa's metadata. The Württemberg ambassador in Venice had written to his court a week earlier that the war was pointless and that they should yield. Rosa conveyed to Daniel the gist, not the content, but the fact and the direction. Daniel calculated the delivery time. If the Spanish letter were delayed by a day, the Württemberg compromise would reach Heidelberg first, and the elector would read the peace proposal before receiving a reply from Madrid. Human nature would do the rest. It is easier to accept peace when it is already on the table
than to wait for a war that is still on its way. And that is exactly what happened. The elector accepted the compromise. The letter from Madrid arrived the next day. The elector read it and replied that the matter had already been settled. The war did not begin. No one died. No one ever found out why. Daniel sat in his office, staring at his hands. The same hands, ink-stained fingers. Not a single drop of blood. He had just prevented a war by delaying a single letter by 24 hours. He felt no pride. He felt fear. Because it had been easy, terrifyingly easy. And if it's easy to prevent a war, it's just as easy to start one. To hold up the wrong letter. To speed up the wrong reply. One miscalculation, and instead of peace, he'd end up with 10,000 corpses. He promised himself he'd only intervene when he was certain, only when he saw the whole picture, only when the alternative was worse. He knew he'd break that promise, sooner or later, because the picture is never complete, and the alternative is a matter of perspective. But now, today, he had saved 2 small principalities from senseless bloodshed, and that was enough to let him sleep peacefully. October. Gaspar had found a vulnerability in the fake drafts. Daniel learned about this from Isabel. Her contact in Brussels reported that the Spanish advisor had left his home for the first time in months and spent 2 hours at the governor's office. He emerged from there in high spirits. Gaspar believed he had won. He had found a weakness in Robert Hartley's system, and now he was going to use it to read the intercepted letters. Daniel prepared himself. He began sending letters via Mechelen that looked like ordinary client correspondence, but contained false information. Information that Gaspar could decrypt using the vulnerability he'd found, and which led him in the direction Daniel wanted. The first fake letter mentioned a major deal by the Fuggers in Lisbon. The deal didn't exist. But if Gaspar passed this information on to the Spanish crown, and the Spaniards tried to capitalize on it, they'd get burned. And Gaspar would lose their trust. The second letter hinted that Robert Hartley was planning to move from Antwerp to Hamburg. A lie. But if Gaspar shifted his hunt to Hamburg, he would lose months. The third letter was the most important. It contained an excerpt from correspondence between 2 fictional agents. In the correspondence, one of them mentioned that Hartley's system had a weakness, that the keys were not generated randomly, but according to a formula that could be calculated. It was an invitation, a decoy. If Gaspar believed it, he would spend years trying to find a formula that didn't exist. Because Daniel's keys were random, truly random, generated using methods that didn't exist in that era. Daniel sent all 3 letters during the month of November. And then he waited. December brought news from London. Walsingham was ill, seriously ill. His agent relayed through a secure channel that the head of intelligence was growing weaker and that a struggle for his legacy was already underway at court. Daniel read the message and realized that time was accelerating. Walsingham was his protection on the English side, not a friend, not a patron, but a man who understood Daniel's value and wouldn't let others touch him. Without Walsingham, the English crown might renegotiate the terms of their cooperation, demand more, or decide that an independent cryptographer was too dangerous. Daniel began to establish a backup channel, a line of communication with the English that bypassed Walsingham's organization, going directly through trading houses, through merchants who were clients of both England and the office at the same time. If Walsingham died and his successors tried to exert pressure, Daniel needed a way to communicate with London without going through intelligence. Annika worked on this channel, quietly, methodically, just like everything else she did.
She didn't ask why. She saw the worry in Daniel's eyes, and that was enough. One late evening, when everyone had left and they were alone in the office, she set a cup of warm cider in front of him. He hadn't asked for it. She didn't explain. Their hands touched over the cup. Both were stained with ink. They both froze for a second. Then Annika withdrew her hand and went back to work. Daniel watched her go. And he thought that if he ever allowed himself to love anyone in this world, it would be a weakness that others would exploit, and that he was already too late with that decision. On April 6, 1590, Francis Walsingham died. Daniel learned of this 3 days later. A courier from Calais brought a brief message. The boss is dead. Robert Cecil is taking over. New instructions are expected. Robert Cecil, young, ambitious, son of Lord Burleigh, a man who did not build the intelligence service from scratch like Walsingham, but inherited it ready-made. Heirs are always more dangerous than founders. A founder knows the value of every cog. An heir sees only the mechanism and believes he can replace any part. A month after Walsingham's death, a letter arrived at the office from London. Not from Philippe's. From a man who identified himself as a representative of the new leadership. The letter contained 2 points. First, the English Crown values its cooperation with the House of Faithful Letters and wishes to continue it. Second, the English Crown deems it necessary to revise the terms. The new terms require Daniel to grant London full access to the structure of his system. Keys, protocols, lists of couriers, routes, everything. Not just the use of the system, ownership of it. Daniel read it and placed the letter on the table. Gently, carefully, like placing a knife that had just been pulled from a wound. He'd expected this. He'd prepared for it. And yet, when it happened, he felt something cold tighten inside him. He wrote a reply. Polite, firm. The House of Loyal Letters does not disclose the system structure to anyone. This is not a condition for negotiations. It is the foundation of the firm's existence. If a client gains access to the system as a whole, the system ceases to be secure for all other clients. This is not a personal choice. It is mathematics. The reply from London arrived 2 weeks later, shorter than the previous one. It contained a single sentence beyond the formal pleasantries. The British Crown regards Mr. Ashcroft's refusal as a hostile act and reserves the right to take appropriate measures. A threat, an open one. Daniel assembled his team, not for a meeting, for a briefing. He handed out a sealed envelope to each person. Inside were instructions in case he was arrested, killed, or went missing. Annika was given authority to run the office. Maggie received alternative routes and passwords for communicating with each client. Johann was ordered to destroy the metadata logs if the office were to be raided. Cecilia received the most important instruction. If Daniel disappeared, she was to go to Venice to see Rosa. She was to take all the keys with her, commit them to memory, not write a single one down, and hand over control of the entire network to Rosa. Rosa in Venice received a separate letter. In it, Daniel wrote to her for the first time what he had never said out loud. He wrote that she was the sharpest mind he'd ever met in this world, and that if anything happened to him, the entire operation would pass to her. Not as an inheritance, as a responsibility. Isabel was given a special assignment. She was to use her French connections to arrange a meeting, not with the English, but with Robert Cecil's people. But not in London, and not in Calais. In Antwerp, on Daniel's turf. Isabel worked for 3 weeks. She drew on every connection, every name, every memory from her past life at court. And she arranged the meeting. Not with Cecil himself, with his trusted representative, a man who had arrived in Antwerp posing as a wool merchant. The meeting took place in the back room of the office. Daniel sat at the desk. Across from him sat an Englishman in his 30s, neat, reserved, with the eyes of a man who considers himself smarter than everyone else in the room. The Englishman repeated his demand: access to the system, full access. Daniel was silent for a minute. Then he opened a desk drawer and took out a stack of papers. He placed them in front of the Englishman. They were letters, 7 of them, intercepted by his network over the past 6 months. Letters that British agents had been sending to one another using the old Walsingham cipher, the very same one that Daniel had cracked in 20 minutes. Each letter was accompanied by a decryption, complete, accurate, with notes indicating where the cipher was particularly weak. The Englishman turned pale. He looked at the decryptions and realized this was no bluff. This man could read English intelligence correspondence more freely than the English themselves. Daniel spoke, quietly, calmly. He said he was no enemy of England, that he had never used these decrypts, that he had kept them specifically for this moment, as a safety net. He said that if England tried to take his system by force, he would publish the contents of these letters, not to the British, to the Spanish, to the Venetians, to everyone. And British intelligence would lose every agent mentioned in those letters overnight. He said he didn't want that he preferred cooperation, but on equal terms, as before. The Englishman was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He said he would pass the message on, and he left. A month later, a new letter arrived from London. The old terms had been restored. The contract was extended, without any reservations. Daniel burned the 7 decrypted messages in the office fireplace. Annika stood beside him. She watched as the paper turned black and curled up. Then she said quietly that he had just gone through a moment when most people would have broken down. Daniel didn't answer. He stared into the fire and thought about how those 7 letters had been his last trump card. He had played it. There would be no more trump cards like that. From that day on, he played without a safety net. The summer of 1591. Antwerp was sweltering. The canals stank. Flies buzzed over the market stalls. Daniel sat in his office on Kammerstraat and read Johann's report. 23 clients, 6 routes, 2 branches, Antwerp and Venice. The office's revenue exceeded 1,000 guilders a month. That was enough money to buy a small estate. Daniel didn't buy anything. He reinvested every extra guilder back into the business, into people, into horses, into paper and ink, in spare sets of keys, in storage rooms, in security. He sat at the same desk he'd sat at 4 years ago when he was a nobody. The same chair, the same inkwell. Only his fingers had grown calloused from the pen, and his eyes had aged from sleepless nights. 4 years. He had spent 4 years in this world. And in those 4 years, the world around him had changed. Not all of it, but that part of the world that dealt with paper and ink. Letters from clients of the House of Faithful Letters reached their destination. Letters from others were intercepted, opened, forged, or lost. Not a single one of his. Not a single one. In 4 years. And people noticed. Not publicly, not in the newspapers. In quiet conversations, at private dinners, in whispers between bankers and envoys. The name Ashcroft became a password, not a person's name, but a symbol of reliability. This was sent through Ashcroft meant the letter was genuine, that no one had read it, that the message could be trusted. He had become a guarantee, a living seal trusted more than the royal one, and he knew what was happening. He knew that the 6 great powers of Europe were writing to one another through him simultaneously. England, Spain through 3 levels of intermediaries, Venice, the Fuggers, the papal nuncio via the Fugger channel, and, more recently, the Dutch states via the Magen route. 6. None of them knew about the other 5. Each was convinced that Daniel worked only for him. And Daniel looked at the map of Europe on the wall and saw what no monarch had seen: the complete picture. All the threads, all the connections, all the silences, and all the outbursts. He saw that Henry of Navarre would convert to Catholicism in 6 months because the frequency of his correspondence with Rome had increased 5-fold over the past 3 months. He saw that the Fuggers were preparing to move their capital from Antwerp to Amsterdam because the volume of their correspondence with Dutch bankers had doubled. He saw that the Ottomans were probing Venetian defenses in the Adriatic because Rosa had detected 4 new courier routes between Constantinople and Dubrovnik. He didn't know the content, only the rhythm. But the rhythm said it all. A sweltering evening. The air in the office stood still. The candles burned steadily. Not a breath of wind. Daniel sat alone. 7 letters lay on the table in front of him. He had received them throughout the day, from various sources, through various channels, and each one demanded a decision. The first, from an English agent in Paris, information about a planned assassination attempt on Henry of Navarre. If he sent this letter to Henry now, the assassination would be prevented. But the English would find out that their agent had been exposed, and the agent would be killed. The second, from the Fuggers, information about the transfer of a large sum from Madrid to Brussels to finance an operation against the Dutch rebels. If this letter is delayed by 3 days, the money will arrive too late and the operation will fail. But the Fuggers will lose their commission and the trust placed in their firm. Third, from Rosa in Venice. The Council of 10 has intercepted correspondence between the papal nuncio and Madrid. They know that Philip II is planning a new military expedition. Not the Armada, smaller, but enough to devastate the Dutch coast. 4th, 5th, 6th, each demanded a choice. Each carried consequences. Human lives, not abstract, specific. People with names, with families, with children. The 7th letter was special. It didn't come from a client. It came from Gaspard de Leon, personally. Not addressed to Robert Hartley, it was addressed to Daniel Ashcroft. He knew. Somehow he had learned his real name. Daniel opened the letter. It wasn't encrypted, plain text. In flawless Latin. Gaspar wrote that he'd spent a year chasing a red herring, that he'd found a vulnerability in Hartley's drafts, that he'd exploited it, that he'd read the planted letters, and that after 3 months, he realized he'd been deceived, that the vulnerability was a hoax, that Hartley didn't exist, and that all this time he had been hunting a shadow that Daniel himself had created for him. Gaspar wrote that it had been beautiful. He used the same word that Philippe's had used in Calais. Beautiful. Then he wrote that he no longer worked for the Spanish crown, that he had left the Escorial, that he was living in Bruges, alone, and that he wanted to meet. Not as an enemy, not as a hunter, but as a man who, for the first time in his life, had encountered a mind equal to his own, and who wanted to understand, not the system, not the cipher, but the man who had created it all. Daniel read the letter twice. Then he placed it on the table next to the other 6. 7 letters, 7 decisions. He stood up and walked over to the window. Antwerp lay below, quiet, stifling. Somewhere far to the north, in Amsterdam, a new trading republic was rising. In the south, in Rome, the Pope was weaving intrigues. In the west, in London, Cecil was sharpening his teeth on anyone who didn't bow to the crown. In the east, in Prague, Emperor Rudolph was gathering alchemists and dreamers. And they were all writing to one another. And they were all dependent on the thin thread running through a small office on Kammerstraat. The door opened. They entered one after another. Annika, with keys on her belt, with ink on her fingers, with quiet strength in every gesture. She sat down to the right of the table, her place, always on the right. Rosa, she had arrived from Venice 2 days earlier, tanned, thinner, with eyes that held the entire Adriatic. She sat by the wall, her arms crossed. Maggie, fresh off the road, dust on her boots, sweat on her forehead. Her red hair had escaped from under her bonnet. She didn't sit down. She remained standing by the door, as always. Isabel, upright, calm. She sat down across from Daniel. Their eyes met, and in her gaze he saw what he always saw: equality. She didn't look up at him from below. She didn't look down on him from above. She looked straight at him. Cecilia, quiet, motionless. She sat in the corner, hands on her knees. Her face was calm. But her eyes saw everything, as always. Johann was the last to enter. He sat down by the door. He placed his hands on his knees, old hands with monk's calluses. Everyone was in their place. Daniel looked at them, one by one. These people had entrusted their lives to him, not because he had saved them, not because he'd paid them, because he'd seen in each of them what no one else had seen, and he'd given each of them a place where they were seen. He pointed to the 7 letters. He explained each one, briefly, without unnecessary words. The first, the attempt on Heinrich's life. The second, funds for the operation against the Dutch. The third, Philip's plans, and so on. The 7th, the letter from Gaspar. He didn't hide anything. For the first time, he showed them the whole picture. Not his piece of it, not their pieces. The whole thing. Because the moment had come when he could no longer carry this burden alone. They listened in silence. Then Daniel fell silent and waited. Isabel was the first to speak. She said that the attempt on Henry's life must be prevented. Not because Henry is a good man, because his death would unleash a war that would kill more people than a single English agent could save. Maggie said the money bound for Brussels had to be held up. She knew the Dutch soldiers. She'd seen their faces. They didn't deserve what was in store for them. Rosa said the information about Philip's plans had to be passed on to the Dutch. Not through the English, directly, so the Dutch would have time to prepare. Annika was silent. Then she said one thing. She said that the 7th letter was lying on the table and that Daniel hadn't yet said what he was going to do with it. Daniel looked at Gaspar's letter, the man who had been hunting him for 3 years. A genius, a man possessed, dangerous, and lonely, just like Daniel himself. He said he'd meet with him. Cecilia looked up. She looked at him. And for the first time in all this time, she said what she'd been keeping to herself for over a year. She spoke quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. She said that Daniel wasn't from here, that she'd known this for a long time. that he thinks differently from everyone she's ever met, that he knows things he couldn't possibly know, that she doesn't know where he's from.
But she knows he didn't come here by chance. The silence was absolute. 6 pairs of eyes were fixed on Daniel. He stood by the window, his back to them, facing Antwerp at night. The bell of the Cathedral of Our Lady struck 3. He was silent for a long time. Then he turned around. He looked at Cecilia, at Annika, at Rose, at Maggie, at Isabel, at Johann. He didn't confirm it, he didn't deny it. He said it didn't matter where he came from. What mattered was that he was here, and that these people in this room were all he had in this world. Johann stood up. He walked to the door. He turned around. He said he didn't know who Daniel was, that he knew only one thing, that tonight, in this room, Daniel would save more people than Johann had saved in his entire life at the monastery. Good night. He left. One by one, the others followed him out. Maggie lingered. She looked at Daniel. She nodded. She left. Rosa walked past him toward the door. She stopped. She didn't turn around. She said quietly that the darkness suited him. She left. Isabel was the last to get up. She walked over to him. Close. She looked him in the eyes. She said he didn't have to carry this burden alone. That he hadn't had to for a long time. She left. Annika remained. She was always the last to leave. She walked over to the table. She picked up the 7th letter. She looked at it. She put it back. Then she walked over to Daniel and stood next to him by the window, shoulder to shoulder, in silence. They stood like that for a minute. 2, 3. Then Annika said that tomorrow would be a hard day and that he needed to get at least 2 hours of sleep. Daniel nodded. Annika left. He was left alone. He took 3 letters, the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th. He slowly held them up to the candle's flame. The paper caught fire. He watched as the flames devoured the words. These letters would never reach their recipients, and the wars they might have sparked would never begin. He'd give the 4th one to Maggie in the morning, via Aachen, not via Cologne, by dawn. He'd give the 2nd one to Rosa, Venice, personally to the Doge, no intermediaries. He'll give the 6th to Isabel, so that the French court would think it had intercepted it itself. The 7th, Gaspar's letter. He won't burn it or send it. He'll put it in a chest. He'll meet with Gaspar, face to face, one mind against another. But not now. It's night now, and outside the window, the Antwerp bell is striking 4 in the morning. And at the Escorial, one of Philippe's secretaries is, at this very moment, signing an order that will never reach its destination. In London, Robert Cecil is, at this very moment, reading a report in which the surname Ashcroft is written without a title and without explanation. Just the surname, and beneath it, a single line. Requires special consideration. And in Bruges, in a small room, Gaspar de Leon is sitting at an empty desk. Not a single sheet of paper in front of him, not a single number. Just a window through which he gazes at the stars, and he thinks of the man he never managed to defeat. Daniel blew out the candle. Darkness filled the office. He sat at the empty desk, at the very same desk he'd sat down at 4 years ago, when he had nothing but someone else's fingerprints and someone else's name.
Now he had everything. A network that saw right through Europe. People who followed him without asking where. Enemies who respected him more than their own kings. And quiet power. Not a crown, not an army, not gold. Just confidence. Confidence that the letter would reach its destination. That the order would be real. That a word would remain a word. He gave the world that certainty. And the world laid at his feet what it had never given to any king. Control. Not over people, over what they say to one another. He stood up, walked through the dark office, climbed the creaky staircase to his room, lay down on the narrow bed, closed his eyes, and had a single thought. The very same one that started it all 4 years ago. When he woke up on a straw mattress and saw someone else's ink-stained fingers. Back then, he thought he could do anything here. Now, he knew he could, and that it wouldn't end. Tomorrow, new letters would arrive, new decisions, new lives hanging in the balance. And he would sit down at the desk again, and once more, he would have to choose. Because he was no longer a clerk. He was the one who moved the pieces. The gray cardinal whose name appears in no chronicle. A man from nowhere, sitting in a modest office on a quiet street in Antwerp, shuffling envelopes. A-changing the world. Daniel received 7 letters, each requiring a decision that would affect the fates of thousands of people, including a personal letter from Gaspar, who had admitted defeat and left the service. For the first time, Cecilia said aloud that Daniel was not of this world. The entire team gathered in the office, and everyone voiced their opinions on the decisions before dispersing to carry them out. Daniel burned 3 letters, thereby preventing wars, sent 4 through his network, and remained alone in the darkness, realizing that he had become who he wanted to be, a power behind the scenes, invisible, irreplaceable, reshaping the fate of Europe from a small office on Kammerstraat.